Who's on China's rich list and how they spend their money? Now this is thoughtful. Hello, I'm Trevor Lai in Shanghai. We've talked a lot on our show about affluent Chinese, but today we're looking at the very top end of this consumer segment. We're joined in our studio today by Rupert Hugeworth, Chairman and Chief Researcher of Hurun Report, a leading luxury publishing group based in Shanghai. Rupert, welcome back. You've been on our show before talking about China's most valuable brands. Today you'll be talking about the most valuable consumers.
Yes.
Hurun recently released its 2013 Rich List. Can you talk a bit about what goes into forming these lists and your research?
Yeah, we just released our first formal global rich list, which is a listing of the 1,500 odd billionaires around the whole world. And this list taken us about 2 years in planning and then actually doing the research to come up with. And it's effectively taken Forbes on one, and because it's actually ranking all the top entrepreneurs in the world. Now the reason we're doing this is because we found that the Chinese entrepreneurs have been growing very fast. So 10 years ago they were nowhere. And now when they take stock of where they are, and they suddenly realize that the businesses that they've grown are no longer just China-beating businesses, they're actually global businesses in many, or they're globally beating businesses. And what they've done in the past 10 years, they've taken them up from sort of rags to riches, but what are the real riches? Well, they're top 1,000 possibly in the world. And I guess that was the purpose of doing a list like this, is that you can see these entrepreneurs just growing so big, and then suddenly being on a peer with some very famous household brands and household names around the rest of the world. It's a pretty cool list, actually.
Well, and on your list, it talks about this so-called 9-0 club. And in Greater China, apparently, there are 349 billionaires, US dollar billionaires now. Where does this wealth come from? I mean, is there concentration in terms of industries or businesses?
The main wealth creator has been real estate. So for the whole list, it was real estate was number one, followed by, I think it was investments, TMT, and then investments, and then retail. So they're the big four. But then when we narrowed this down to look at China, we found, again, real estate number one. Mainly it's driven by the Hong Kong people, because just about any billionaire in Hong Kong is doing real estate almost as their first thing. But one of the things that came out that was very interesting is we looked at the top 10 real estate tycoons around the world, 7 of them from China. 5 of those are Hong Kong, 2 from mainland China. So it's 7 out of 10 are from China. The other 2, or 3, there are 2 from England, and there's 1 from America.
And is this something that's a ranking and a concentration that has changed in the past 5 years? So maybe 5 or 10 years. 10 years ago, perhaps that top 10 list would have been predominantly non-Chinese?
One thing I found very interesting is when you look at the geography of where they come from. And America is number 1, they've got 400 plus. You've just said China's number 2, 350 plus, right? These billionaires around the world. Then you look at number 3 is Russia. Now Russia's only got 88. So I mean the gap between number 2 and number 3 is huge. Then you've got Germany, then you've got Britain and the various other, India, and the rest of the countries, if you like. But the fact that China's billionaires, if you like, these business people have grown so fast and so strong, in my opinion, really says something about the economy. And 10 years ago, they were nowhere at all. Suddenly you can see them coming up. And we did another analysis. We looked at where they live around the world. So, okay, number 1 city full of billionaires is actually Moscow. So they've got 78 out of the 1,500 or so living in Moscow. And number 2 was New York, and number 3 was Hong Kong. But what, again, was quite curious, if you look at the top 10 cities that people live in, 5 are from Greater China. So you've got sort of Hong Kong, Beijing, Shanghai, Shenzhen, and Taipei is Greater China. So 5 out of the top 10 cities are Greater China. There's a huge swing of wealth from west to east that we can see coming out of this list.
And this gap that you mentioned earlier, it's not just about today and a snapshot in time, but it's also about the growth rate and the rate of growth for billionaires in China, according to McKinsey and Mingsen. And this is also touched upon in your report. Through to 2015, the growth rate is actually expected to increase. Do you agree with this prediction?
Oh, I very much agree. I think that the speed of growth of these people and the economy that they're operating in at the moment means that if you extrapolate just based on some sort of political stable environment, then they're growing here at 10%, people in the West are growing at 2%, but it doesn't take a lot of brains to work out that 10% accumulated over 3 to 5 years is going to be a doubling effect almost, and in the West it's going to be much smaller. Plus the fact, if you look at the average age of these billionaires, right, you've got the average age is 63 around the whole world. In China, or Greater China, it was only 58, so 5 years younger. And that's because here people are predominantly all self-made. So it's all first-generation wealth here. And there's a different type of energy and buzz, I think, that you get from first-generation wealth. They're just out there to prove it and to get as big as they possibly can, because that's what they're really good at.
Well, you talked about now China really, and entrepreneurs and some of these self-made billionaires on your list,
yes,
really looking now at themselves and their companies on a global scale. The way that you define high net worth individuals in China, is that the same way you define them across the board?
We would tend to define high net worth as somebody who's probably got, the best part to say, 2-3 million US dollars, and somewhere, total wealth of about that sort of number. And an ultra high net worth, somebody's got about 10 million, 15 million US dollars, if you like. And that's roughly the descriptions that we would use.
And let's shift and talk about your 2013 Best of the Best report.
Yes.
There are a lot of interesting things in here, specifically because we've talked about China's most valuable brands previously. Yes. And Mout was one that we had actually discussed in some length, in some detail before. So talk to us about how Mout dropped out. Obviously, everybody knows about the change in government policy, which probably had the most significant effect. But were there other trends or other factors?
Well, we did Chinese luxury consumer report, and we put it out now for 9 years on the trot. And last year, one of the new questions that we asked is, what is your preferred brand to gift? Because there's this huge gifting process here in China that's become very, very obvious. And when we did it last year, we saw that Mout came in at 4th out of 10. And that really shocked a lot of people, because they had no idea that Mout was really such a gift, a wanted gift, right up there with Apple and LV and some of the sort of the famous brands that you might otherwise have expected to be there. But when we redid the list this year, we looked at the top 10 or top 15, in fact, sort of brands for gifting, it was a really different story. Mout had been hammered in the media recently because A, it's a luxury brand, and government officers are not allowed to drink luxury, as you would expect anywhere in the world, but for China, of course. And B, you've got, there was sort of a health scare issues about sort of plastic tops, about whether that was going to give you cancer or some related form of cancer. So I think the combination of those two actually really pushed Mout's sort of desirability, if you like, right down. Plus you've got a big problem of fakes in the market, and I don't think that helps the matter when every second person you talk to says, oh yes, well I had a
30-year, 50-year.
I had a, yeah, exactly, and it tasted like nothing of that it should taste like. Another trend that we found coming out of this gifting was that it's becoming cheaper. People wouldn't want to gift such expensive gifts as before. So last year we found, for example, 1 or 2 watch brands on there. This year, out of the top 15, there was only 1 watch brand, pure watch brand, that was on there. That was Longines, came in at number 15. And they'd actually kicked out of the list, brands like, I think there was Rolex brand in there last year. And it's quite easy to understand to me, because a Longines watch would sort of starting price probably about 8,000 RMB, whereas Rolex would probably be 5 times that, 40,000, possibly 50,000. And I think, I don't want to say it's coming to what I would call under westernized normality, whereby people don't gift expensive things. But I think we're certainly seeing people
pulling
retrench,
back a bit. Yes.
Pulling back. They're not wanting to gift something obviously bling bling.
Sure.
Here's a great big price tag on it, but actually here's something that I can offer you and you can accept. And mind you, 8,000 quid is still a jolly expensive watch by anybody's standard.
But I thought it's funny that you mentioned, luxury and certain brands being too bling bling and moving Mout out, but yet you see Gucci and Mont Blanc jumping in, and Burberry as well, and these are obviously not perhaps that understated as brands.
No, they're not understated. I think there is a sort of a general trend that people are becoming more sophisticated as such. They don't just want to buy a brand that's well known for the mistress market, say the LV, that a lot of people call it, the mistress bag. And they want a bag with a bit more sort of culture, something that perhaps stands for, as you say, perhaps more understated, or the advertising is just not so mass everywhere. And I think that's where newcomers, relative newcomers like Burberry, like Gucci, LV's been here for ages, and it's been one of its strengths. It's got a great distribution thing. But Burberry and Gucci, relatively speaking, have sort of reinvented themselves, at least for the Chinese market. in the last, say, 5 years. And I think that's been one of the attractions. There's an element of fresh here as well. But I think another thing that's worth pointing out is that, and although I'm English and I'm saying this, is that these Chinese luxury consumers, they have a complete love affair with anything French. They just love French brands. They love traveling to France. It's anything French for them. It just represents something amazing.
Well, France was the #1 destination in your
France
report.
was the destination of choice, followed by the US. Actually, Britain, where I come from, made it into the top 10 for the first time ever, and despite the visa problems that we've got because we're not part of Schengen. And that's probably on the back of the Olympics anyway.
Now, people have been saying for a long time that money doesn't buy you happiness. And apparently this is one of the findings from your report. This applies to Chinese millionaires and billionaires as well. Talk to us about why you're finding so many of these high net worth individuals in China being increasingly less satisfied with their quality of life.
I think that's a slight misrepresentation of the report. In fact, money does buy you happiness, is the general feel of what I was trying to say. Is that 90% of the people that have more than, that's what we call them ultra high net worth or high net worths, claim to be very happy at business and very happy in their personal life. And where there was a slight disbalance is that it dropped slightly for people who were ultra rich and who maybe have more than 10, 15 million US dollars. They're the ones who are slightly less happy, but only talking about like 5, 10% points. But generally speaking, they're right up there in the high 80s and even in the 90s, professing to be quite happy. So I think the answer is yes, money does buy you happiness, but too much of it isn't really going to make you any happier. And we worked out there's a sort of magic cut-off point, and I think the cut-off point is roughly around 5 to 8 million US dollars. If you've got that sort of amount, you're perfectly happy, you've got no responsibilities, particularly in society. Not everybody's going to be saying, give us some money for charity. You can just basically buy a nice house.
Quite enough to give away.
You can buy a nice house and you can have a nice relaxed life and not have to worry too much of the financial future. Whereas if you've got, sort of much more than 20, 30 million US dollars, that's going to become a burden. And anyway, you're never going to spend it in your life anyway. You can't ever spend that sort of money.
Well, what are some of the things that they're finding then specifically in terms of health and family and things like that? Are their concerns shifting once they get into that, including, for example, second generation, fighting over wealth? This is something that's come up actually in certain reports and interviews with individuals. The
health issue, I think, becomes very important. I think it's also sort of the meaningfulness of what they're doing that becomes very important. So we've seen a sort of a strong sort of growth in religious beliefs amongst people who are super rich or very young people. We've seen an element of wanting to, they've got the choice when they've got to a certain amount of financial freedom. So they can move where they want to. They move their family often out of the polluted cities, sometimes in China, and they're thinking about emigrating possibly to the US, preferred destination at the moment, and Australia, Canada, Singapore and Asia has done very, very well at attracting these investment visas. And I think that's one of the trends. And I think people emigrating out of China, on the one sense, yeah, there's an element of insurance policy. They're looking to just get a permanent residency overseas should they ever need it. On another sense, I think there's this huge demand for education products, especially for their children. 90% of this super wealthy group are looking to send their children to study overseas. 90% is unbelievably high. I was like bowled over when I heard that statistic, and I thought, and in Japan, I guess it's less than 10%. In India, probably about 50%, 60%. But in China, it's basically everybody will send their children to study overseas. And they want their children to have a sort of a global outlook, be a bit more questioning, not just sit in a class and be told what to write for the exam and pass the exam.
Well, one of our Sina Weibo fans, Julie Zhu, sent in a question, and she asked, what are some of the new consumption behaviors, the new normal in terms of consumption behaviors of the ultra-rich that surprised you?
I think I heard a wonderful story the other day, and it was of a Chinese entrepreneur who claimed that he made a lot of money in the early 90s. And he said, the first thing I did when I made a lot of money is I went and ripped my house to shreds, and I filled it up with gold. And I put gold bath taps on, gold and all around the house. And then I started traveling. And this is late 90s, early 2000s. I started traveling around the world. I went to America, I went to Singapore, Hong Kong, around Europe, and I suddenly realized that understatement is the new it. So I ripped out all my gold and I went and put in brands. And I think what I've been seeing is that people are much more trying to express themselves through a story or a link with a brand. They love the idea of brands, they love the heritage. Brands make a lot of effort to communicate directly with these people, and they love that. But I think they're looking for their self-expression much more, is what I've seen. One thing that always surprises me with Chinese that I meet, especially the luxury Chinese consumer, they always say to me, oh, we think Chinese are very understated. And yet, they're the #1 purchaser of luxury anywhere in the world. And in fact, if anything, they're extremely not understated, in my opinion. When you compare it with Europeans, who, by definition, especially Northern Europeans, they're the ones who like hide every bit of money that they've got under their bushel. And a lot of Americans also very conservative about showing off in the public eye. Whereas quite a lot of these Chinese are really, they're the ones who are buying the Rolls Royces, the flash cars, the flashy watches, etc., etc. But that's because they're doing it as part of their business almost. It's a business status symbol. Well, it's just their private status symbol.
And I think it's also, as we talk about repeatedly on this show, when you're talking about China, it's a huge numbers game. And the sheer number of millionaires even that have this amount of wealth to be able to push these sort of worldwide sales figures and brands is immense. So even if you had a big percentage of them be understated, just the number of them that are not would actually shift the global perception of Chinese wealthy in general.
Well, I mean, I look at it a little bit as the inflation of luxury. And I remember when, I was in England and I was, I might go and buy a bottle of whiskey. I'd be looking to spend £20 on a bottle of whiskey, and that would be a luxury whiskey, if you like, for me at the time. You come to China and you realize that the whiskies to 10, 15 years ago, you could spend £50, no problem. And now they've actually sort of segmented the industry more and more into smaller and more parcels. So now there are whiskies out there that you can pay, £1,000, £2,000 for. Unbelievable, in my opinion. And that the whole bar of luxury is sort of being pushed up, sometimes by quite small brands. And, but they're very niche brands, and they're beginning to segment the market in such a way that this particular group of people would like to drink my single malt whiskey, for example, which is something that I haven't seen at all before.
That's probably why brands like Virtu, found a second life in Asia in some cases. Now, Beijing-based World Luxury Association also published a report, and they talked about luxury spending in China in January being at its lowest level in 5 years, and also anticipating, double-digit growth actually shrinking to single-digit growth. A lot of this is because the Chinese are, as you've mentioned, traveling overseas. They're, avoiding or taking advantage of, let's say, the price benefits of traveling overseas. But how is China going to grow in the long term if the constant outflow of their consumers, their entrepreneurs, their next generation, it's all going to other countries?
Well, I think the travel retail sector is a fascinating one that's going on, because for a lot of these luxury brands, especially when you're looking at leather goods or watches, something that's easy to carry in your bag, when you go traveling, I would say for a lot of them, at least 50% of their global market is now being purchased by Chinese. So effectively, you need to set up a sort of a advertising billboard here in China by lots and lots of shops and making strong awareness here in China. And then when you've got these luxury consumers trying to get a price advantage, or actually they get a lot of pleasure from going shopping for the same product that you can see here in China, but in Galeries Lafayette in Paris, then they will, they spend their money over there. And what we've seen in the reports is that the Chinese luxury consumer is far and away now the largest spender, and for luxury in around the world. 3 years ago, it was Russians, and China was just below the Russians. 2 years ago, China just pipped the Russians. I think there was 17% compared to 16% of the total volume of spending. And then last year, we saw, whoosh, the Chinese sort of just leave the Russians standing. The average basket was something like €1,000, and the average shopping basket for luxury goods, which is just phenomenal. And you know, the Russians, between the Russians and the Chinese, they made up something like 1/3 of all the luxury spending, you know, that was reported in the world.
Well, lastly, looking ahead, what's a brand that you see in the luxury sector that we should be keeping our eyes on in China?
Rather than come straight out with a brand, I think the type of brand that I would look for is one, I think we've seen a very strong interest in anything French. I think that the Swiss have made a great impact in the watches as well. But ever since the problem with the government officer who was wearing lots of watches, I think the watch sector has been quite impacted by that. And you know, it's still going to grow, and there's still a lot of people who like a beautiful watch. But I would have said, actually, to pick a brand possibly from outside those two traditional powerhouses at the moment. You've got the Italians with some suits and one or two fashion items, but I would probably go, in this case, with Burberry. I've seen they've come in very strong only in the last 3 to 5 years. And prior to that, I remember looking at British brands and always thinking of Dunhill. And they've been left standing. I mean, none of my Chinese friends would even mention Dunhill now. It's now always Burberry. And so I've seen them come up. They've had a very strong online and social media you know, sort of play when they first came in. Now they're building lots of stores. And I would say that's a brand to watch. And I think they're coming in at quite an interesting way for me, at least having watched a lot of brands come into China. So I would go for that in the sort of leather fashion watches category.
Rupert, thanks for joining us on Thoughtful China. We look forward to having you again. That wraps it up for today. Be sure to subscribe to us on Tudo and YouTube. You can also follow us on Weibo and Twitter and join our LinkedIn group. See you again.